Chapter 28 of The Circular Staircase. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Circular Staircase by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 28. A Tramp and the Toothache. The bitterness toward the dead president of the Traders' Bank seemed to grow with time. Never popular, his memory was execrated by people who had lost nothing, but who were filled with disgust by constantly hearing new stories of the man's grasping avarice. The Traders had been a favorite bank for small tradespeople, and in its savings department it had solicited the smallest deposits. People who had thought to be self-supporting to the last found themselves confronting the poorhouse, their $200 or $300 savings wiped away. All bank failures have this element, however, and the directors were trying to promise 20% on deposits. But, like everything else those days, the bank failure was almost forgotten by Gertrude and myself. We did not mention Jack Bailey. I had found nothing to change my impression of his guilt, and Gertrude knew how I felt. As for the murder of the bank president's son, I was of two minds. One day I thought Gertrude knew, or at least suspected, that Jack had done it. The next I feared that it had been Gertrude herself, that night alone on the circular staircase. And then the mother of Lucien Wallace would obtrude herself, and an almost equally good case might be made against her. There were times, of course, when I was disposed to throw all those suspicions aside, and fix definitely on the unknown, whoever that might be. I had my greatest disappointment when it came to tracing Nina Carrington. The woman had gone without leaving a trace. Marked as she was, it should have been easy to follow her, but she was not to be found. A description to one of the detectives on my arrival at home had started the ball rolling, but by night she had not been found. I told Gertrude then about the telegram to Louise when she had been ill before, about my visit to Dr. Walker, and my suspicions that Mattie Bliss and Nina Carrington were the same. She thought, as I did, that there was little doubt of it. I said nothing to her, however, of the detective's suspicions about Alex. Little things that I had not noticed at the time now came back to me. I had an uncomfortable feeling that perhaps Alex was a spy, and that by taking him into the house I had played into the enemy's hand. But by 8 o'clock that night Alex himself appeared, and with him a strange and repulsive individual. They made a queer pair, for Alex was almost as disreputable as the tramp, and he had a badly swollen eye. Gertrude had been sitting listlessly waiting for the evening message from Mr. Jameson, but when the singular pair came in, as they did without ceremony, she jumped up and stood staring. Winters, the detective who watched the house at night, followed them, and kept his eye sharply on Alex's prisoner, for that was the situation as it developed. He was a tall, lanky individual, ragged and dirty, and just now he looked both terrified and embarrassed. Alex was too much engrossed to be either, and to this day I don't think I ever asked him why he went off without permission the day before. "Miss Innes," Alex began abruptly, "this man can tell us something very important about the disappearance of Mr. Innes. I found him trying to sell this watch." He took a watch from his pocket and put it on the table. It was Halsey's watch. I had given it to him on his 21st birthday. I was dumb with apprehension. "He says he had a pair of cufflinks also, but he sold them." "For $1.50, put in the disreputable individual hoarsely, with an eye on the detective. "He is not dead?" I implored. The tramp cleared his throat. "No'm," he said huskily. "He was used up pretty bad, but he weren't dead. He was coming to hisself when I—" He stopped and looked at the detective. "I didn't steal it, Mr. Winters," he whined. "I found it in the road, honest to God I did." Mr. Winters paid no attention to him. He was watching Alex. "I'd better tell what he told me," Alex broke in. "It'll be quicker. When Mr. Jameson calls up, we can start him right. Mr. Winters, I found this man trying to sell that watch on 5th Street. He offered it to me for $3. "How did you know the watch?" Winters snapped at him. "I had seen it before, many times. I used it at night when I was watching at the foot of the staircase." The detective was satisfied. "When he offered the watch to me, I knew it, and I pretended I was going to buy it. We went into an alley, and I got the watch." The tramp shivered. It was plain how Alex had secured the watch. "Then I got the story from this fellow. He claims to have seen the whole affair. He says he was in an empty car, in the car the automobile struck." The tramp broke in here, and told his story with frequent interruptions by Alex and Mr. Winters. He used a strange medley, in which familiar words took unfamiliar meanings, but it was gradually made clear to us. On the night in question the tramp had been pounding his ear, this struck me as being graphic, in an empty box-car along the siding at Casanova. The train was going west, and due to leave at dawn. The tramp and the "brakie" were friendly, and things were going well. About 10 o'clock, perhaps earlier, a terrific crash against the side of the car roused him. He tried to open the door, but could not move it. He got out of the other side, and just as he did so, he heard someone groan. The habits of a lifetime made him cautious. He slipped onto the bumper of a car and peered through. An automobile had struck the car and stood there on two wheels. The tail lights were burning, but the headlights were out. Two men were stooping over someone who lay on the ground. Then the taller of the two started on a dog trot along the train looking for an empty. He found one 4 cars away and ran back again. The two lifted the unconscious man into the empty box-car, and getting in themselves stayed there for 3 or 4 minutes. When they came out, after closing the sliding door, they cut up over the railroad embankment toward the town. One, the short one, seemed to limp. The tramp was wary. He waited for 10 minutes or so. Some women came down a path to the road and inspected the automobile. When they had gone, he crawled into the box-car and closed the door again. Then he lighted a match. The figure of a man, unconscious, gagged, and with his hands tied, lay far at the end. The tramp lost no time. He went through his pockets, found a little money and the cuff links, and took them. Then he loosened the gag, it had been cruelly tight, and went his way, again closing the door of the box-car. Outside on the road he found the watch. He got on the fast freight east some time after, and rode into the city. He had sold the cuff links, but on offering the watch to Alex, he had been copped. The story, with its cold recital of villainy, was done. I hardly knew if I were more anxious or less. That it was Halsey there could be no doubt. How badly he was hurt, how far he had been carried, were the questions that demanded immediate answer. But it was the first real information we had had. My boy had not been murdered outright. But instead of vague terrors, there was now the real fear that he might be lying in some strange hospital, receiving the casual attention commonly given to the charity cases. Even this, had we known it, would have been paradise to the terrible truth. I wake yet and feel myself cold and trembling with the horror of Halsey's situation for 3 days after his disappearance. Mr. Winters and Alex disposed of the tramp with a warning. It was evident he had told us all he knew. We had occasion within a day or two to be doubly thankful that we had given him his freedom. When Mr. Jameson telephoned that night, we had news for him. He told me what I had not realized before, that it would not be possible to find Halsey at once, even with this clue. The cars, by this time, 3 days, might be scattered over the Union, but he said to keep on hoping, that it was the best news we had had. And in the meantime, consumed with anxiety as we were, things were happening at the house in rapid succession. We had one peaceful day, then Liddy took sick in the night. I went in when I heard her groaning, and found her with a hot water bottle to her face, and her right cheek swollen until it was glassy. "Toothache?" I asked, not too gently. "You deserve it. A woman of your age, who would rather go around with an exposed nerve in her head than have the tooth pulled. It would be over in a moment." "So would hanging," Liddy protested from behind the hot water bottle. I was hunting around for cotton and laudanum. "You have a tooth just like it yourself, Miss Rachel," she whimpered, "and I'm sure Dr. Boyle's been trying to take it out for years." There was no laudanum, and Liddy made a terrible fuss when I proposed carbolic acid, just because I had put too much on the cotton once and burned her mouth. I'm sure it never did her any permanent harm. Indeed, the doctor said afterward that living on a liquid diet had been a splendid rest for her stomach. But she would have none of the acid, and she kept me awake groaning. So at last I got up and went to Gertrude's door. To my surprise, it was locked. I went around by the hall and into her bedroom that way. The bed was turned down, and her dressing gown and nightdress lay ready in the little room next, but Gertrude was not there. She had not undressed. I don't know what terrible thoughts came to me in the minute I stood there. Through the door I could hear Liddy grumbling, with a squeal now and then when the pain stabbed harder. Then, automatically, I got the laudanum and went back to her. It was fully half an hour before Liddy's groans subsided. At intervals I went to the door into the hall and looked out, but I saw and heard nothing suspicious. Finally, when Liddy had dropped into a doze, I even ventured as far as the head of the circular staircase, but there floated up to me only the even breathing of Winters, the night detective, sleeping just inside the entry. And then, far off, I heard the rapping noise that had lured Louise down the staircase that other night, 2 weeks before. It was over my head, and very faint, 3 or 4 short muffled taps, a pause, and then again, stealthily repeated. The sound of Mr. Winter's breathing was comforting. With the thought that there was help within call, something kept me from waking him. I did not move for a moment. Ridiculous things Liddy had said about a ghost. I am not at all superstitious, except perhaps in the middle of the night, with everything dark, things like that came back to me. Almost beside me was the clothes chute. I could feel it, but I could see nothing. As I stood, listening intently, I heard a sound near me. It was vague, indefinite. Then it ceased. There was an uneasy movement and a grunt from the foot of the circular staircase, and silence again. I stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Then I knew I had been right. Someone was stealthily passing the head of the staircase and coming toward me in the dark. I leaned against the wall for support. My knees were giving way. The steps were close now, and suddenly I thought of Gertrude. Of course it was Gertrude. I put out one hand in front of me, but I touched nothing. My voice almost refused me, but I managed to gasp out, "Gertrude!" "Good Lord!" a man's voice exclaimed just beside me, and then I collapsed. I felt myself going, felt someone catch me, a horrible nausea, that was all I remembered. When I came to, it was dawn. I was lying on the bed in Louise's room, with the cherub on the ceiling staring down at me, and there was a blanket from my own bed thrown over me. I felt weak and dizzy, but I managed to get up and totter to the door. At the foot of the circular staircase, Mr. Winters was still asleep. Hardly able to stand, I crept back to my room. The door into Gertrude's room was no longer locked. She was sleeping like a tired child. And in my dressing room, Liddy hugged a cold hot water bottle and mumbled in her sleep. "There's some things you can't hold with handcuffs," she was muttering thickly. End of chapter 28.